And so let me just, if you can briefly give me your opinion on how do you see this confrontation that's ramping up between the West and China? How do you see it playing out?
It's difficult to say. It's definitely clear that the pandemic is changing the global calculus, and what has already been a trend, which is the U.S.'s decline on the world stage as a global leader, as a hegemon, that was already happening economically, especially. But the U.S. is really walking a very dangerous tightrope. And I believe that there's going to be a lot of conversation trying to pull the Trump administration off of the ledge with China, because the danger of a war with China is probably higher now than it has been in a very long time. Diplomatic relations are at their worst, and this is what is coming out of China, are at their worst since normalization. So that is very troubling. So how this will play out, I'm not sure. Do I predict an outright military confrontation? Not necessarily. I definitely don't necessarily see that in the cards. But does the potential for that happening increase because of all the Trump administration's actions, because of the way that the China hawks are really pressing and advancing their agenda right now to exploit the pandemic? I do see that as continuing. And where it will go, I don't think we can have a crystal ball for that. But we do have to be vigilant in opposing it, because right now, the number one task, I think, for the world is to figure out how to control, how to contain this pandemic. China right now is in a race to try to figure out a vaccine and make it accessible. China was at the World Health Assembly pledging all sorts of investments in pandemic response around the world. And that should be really where the priority is. So right now, the U.S. is peddling conspiracy theories about the virus. It's, getting into all sort of hawkish and militaristic operations in the South China Sea. And it's not just China. It's also Iran, Venezuela. There's so many points of aggression that the U.S. is totally focused on right now. And this is troubling. So, but we also know that we're in an election season, and wars really do fuel politics in the United States. And so there are conversations, I'm sure, in the Trump administration about, well, which foreign policy point will be most effective for re-election. And it is China, because U.S. public opinion on China is at an all-time low.
Right.
Partly because the Trump administration has been so effective in its anti-China messaging. But this is a long-standing policy. The TPP, the Asia pivot, as you said, this did not begin with Trump, and it's been kind of a slow descent into a very confrontational posture, militarily especially, where we're now in this great power competition saga of the U.S. imperial aggression towards China, which should really give us pause, given that China is nuclear armed, Russia is also nuclear armed, and the U.S. has used nuclear weapons and is now discussing testing nuclear weapons again, as of just yesterday. That was reported. So, it's a difficult situation, but I think our principal position should be, we need to defend China from aggression. We need to tell our government they should not be ratcheting up these tensions with China. It doesn't serve any effective purpose. China doesn't want it. China has repeatedly wanted warm relations with the United States. On that level alone, people in the United States who are anti-war, who consider themselves against the neoliberal and neocon establishment, should be opposed to any aggression towards China.
So why is China? I mean, if they know what's happening and they're down with their socialism and they get it and everybody's on board, and why are they so afraid of information? Why would I be able to do a show like this in China?
Well, it's complicated. I think, in terms of your show, that's a difficult question. The reason why there is so much censorship in China around U.S.-based media, especially, Facebook, Google, that sort of thing. It's because the CIA acts as a conduit through all of those things. And, it was WikiLeaks that revealed that, and it was a Chinese cybersecurity firm that used some WikiLeaks documents to show that the CIA had been hacking and doing all sorts of things for 11 straight years in China. There's an actual war going on, and I think that we need to talk about censorship from the perspective of China not necessarily being some equal power to the United States that has similar interests. It's just like the United States in censorship. It tries to, squash political messaging in the same way, but that China is really in a defensive position from the fact that since 1949, it has been under heavy diplomatic, international, and military pressure, economic pressure, and military pressure to basically fall, to be destroyed. And under those conditions, you need a centralized state, and you do need some censorship to ensure that your territorial integrity is maintained and that your national integrity is maintained. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't excesses. That doesn't mean that there aren't mistakes that are made.
So
what it means is that we have to understand the context for why there is hostility towards things like allowing U.S. social media, allowing U.S. search engines to exist in China, because a lot of times military activity happens through those things in foreign countries that the U.S. doesn't like.
It's just my reflex when I hear you say, you're going to need some censorship to maintain your national whatever. It's just, I'm allergic to that. So it's like, hey, you can have all this stuff, but you don't get to have freedom and liberty and freedom of thought and stuff like that. It just, that seems scary to people. To me, that's scary, right? You can understand that, right?
Well, I would say, yeah. I mean, I can understand why, especially from the context, I think it's important to really think about, in the United States, we live in a very censored society. I mean, when we're talking about Hong Kong, for example, these protesters are celebrated, and the media is enamored, the corporate media is enamored by them, Washington is enamored by them, the Guardian's enamored by them. But yet, the Gilets jaunes in France, or
right, they don't cover
for example,
them.
Chelsea Manning, or
right.
We're talking about Julian Assange,
right.
Screw them.
Right.
So in the United States, you have these freedoms so long as you don't challenge the establishment. We have political prisoners, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Sundiata Kohli, we can go down the line, black political prisoners who are rotting in prison because they were just organizing for a better life for black Americans in the United States.
No, America's the largest penal colony in the world.
Exactly.
We claim
and
to
be
we lock up more people than China. So it's crazy, right? So go ahead.
And you have a situation where, even though we have the freedom to use these tools, we're giving these bourgeois freedoms to use, like Google and all that. We know that our content is suppressed on them heavily. Black Agenda Report has experienced this. Russiagate was a big part of that.
Yes, we're a victim of the algorithm too, the Google algorithm.
Right. So I think it's important to look at censorship in China as being a struggle that's a little different. Much different, actually. So, while we are, anti-establishment and we're trying to fight the establishment here in China, they have been under 70 years of aggression from the United States, imperialist aggression, where there had to be certain things done to ensure that China remained an independent government dictated by socialism, not capitalism, not imperialism. And so censorship, in that sense, in that form of class struggle, right? Because if we're talking about class struggle under socialism, there's still class struggle. There's still a struggle to make sure that the old order doesn't come back, that you're not, controlled once again by brutal nationalists that, hacked up peasants like it was, their day job. That the conditions that existed prior to 1949 are things that the United States really wants. It wants China to be a subservient country, a country that serves its interests entirely. It doesn't care that China wants to work with it, wants to cooperate with it, wants to be economically integrated with it. No, it's because China has a government that is not capitalist, that is not subservient, that is not doesn't ultimately answer to Washington. At that level, the U.S. has big issues, and Wall Street also has big issues. I don't know if you remember this in 2019 during all this Hong Kong stuff. George Soros wrote an op-ed in the not Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, saying that the defeat of China is bigger than national security interests. And what he really said in that article was it's about ensuring that Wall Street is predominant around the world. And this is despite the fact that, China is not trying to undermine Wall Street. Wall Street is trying to undermine China, and China is trying to figure out a way to do things on its own, especially around the realms of finance.
Okay, well, all right. So I think because this conversation is not over, we're going to keep talking a lot more about China going forward, and I'll keep bringing on people like Danny and people who disagree with him. So people get angry at this show because I bring on people with different points of view. I think that's good, and especially since I'm no expert on China. So I bring on people who know more about it. I bring on Danny, I bring on Matt Stoller, Dylan Radigan. I'm going to try and bring on Ben Norton from the Gray Zone coming up this week. So you're going to get a lot of perspectives, and then you also can, and then you can choose what you think is your perspective. How about that? I think China's, just commie evil, and then we should probably go to war. But no, it's certainly a much more complicated story than you would think. And yeah, I mean, the Hong Kong protests. Would you say that? So, what do you account for the discrepancy, Danny, between you saying 35,000 people and the Western media saying 2 million people that protested in Hong Kong?
I think it's the same discrepancy of, jihadists in Syria being labeled freedom fighters, right? It's a propaganda ploy. It's a way of making a so-called opposition movement, which is really just a movement created by the NED, heavily sponsored by the NED, with obvious prerogatives of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And it's a way to make that look like a grassroots indigenous movement that represents the interests of people in Hong Kong, which it obviously does not if it is being peddled and literally controlled by U.S. forces. I mean, that is the principal issue here, is that we have this so-called movement, which is, holding up American flags, singing the Star Spangled Banner, and saying how much they love Trump and want Trump to intervene. That doesn't sound like a progressive movement to me. It sounds like one that is trying to strengthen the U.S.'s hand in that region. And it's one that doesn't care about Hong Kong. It cares more about how close it can cuddle with the imperialists.
Okay, Danny Haiphong, Black Agenda Report. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. We'll have you back for sure. And anything you want to say before you go?
I'll just say that, with Hong Kong and just with everything that's going on right now, with China, we're going to hear a lot more because, as I said before, China is holding its 2 sessions. A lot of policies are going to be rolled out in China. And this pandemic that has ravaged the United States, both economically, politically, as well as just cost so many lives. There is such a material interest of the United States' ruling class across the board, but especially the Trump administration, which is trying to win another election in November, to scapegoat China. And I think a lot of the reaction to what's going on in Hong Kong is part of this larger agenda. It's part of the scapegoating China agenda to secure Trump's position, but also to strengthen a longstanding policy of military aggression towards China in order to contain it. This is all about weakening China's position in the world. I don't think it's going to work, but it is dangerous and it will be costly, right? Not only are taxpayer dollars going to the millions of dollars these Hong Kong protesters are receiving, but also these protests are violent. They threaten civil distress and strife, and it could lead to a very bloody situation, which nobody wants. Nobody who has any real interest in peace, in stability, in prosperity, in anything that matters to the lives of working people. Nobody wants that. So we have to be very vigilant. And even if we don't know much about China, even if we are in disagreement about how they organize themselves and how they politically organize themselves, our principal role is to defeat and stop U.S. imperialism. That is our number one goal. It should be our number one goal, and it's going to have to be our number one goal going into this election, because I sense from everything that's going on right now, all of the innuendo that's being spewed by the media, by the Trump administration, by the Democrats, it's gonna get more intense.
Danny Haiphong from the Black Agenda Report. Thank you very much, buddy, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Okay, bye. Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?